Hello, I'm Hushicho, artist and creator. I'm here to do a speed paint tutorial for you, and if you like what you see, please follow me on social media and become a patron on Patreon. For as little as $5, you can get a lot of bonuses. Here we have Tonyan, one of my characters, and I'm just using the fill tool here at first, and I thought I would use the blue tone on the background because it's a opposite color on the color wheel, so that it will bring out those spots that I didn't get with the bucket fill. Basically, the way that you start is you take one layer and you try and fill it in with base color. It's easy to do that with the bucket tool in Clip Studio Paint, which is Manga Studio 5, and here when I'm doing the little details, I don't really have to get it too exact because the hair will be on another layer on top. And layer position is important. Depending on your program, layers may do different things. So know what your layers mean, know what your layer blending modes are, and know how to arrange them so that you can put certain things on top and other things on bottom and so forth. But basically all we're doing now is going around and making sure that any places with blue showing through get filled in with the base skin tone. And now I've made another layer for the white of the eyes, and the eyes in general, as well as the white of the teeth. It's fine that this is a hard brush. Basically, it's my own pen that I made to do my coloring in and my art. And now we can get rid of that paper color since we don't need the contrast anymore. So now I'm creating another layer and filling in the hair. And I'll need to also do something with the little bits that didn't quite get filled in with the bucket. I'm not using a flush to the left gray, I'm using a slightly bluish gray, and I advise this, use something that's slightly a color, just a little bit, because that gives it more character, I feel like, instead of just the black or white or gray. I do a lot of work in screen tone, but if I'm going to use color, I want to use actual color. So I'm just going around here. Usually when I lock the layer, it's something that I go back and forth on. And now I advise choosing a just slightly darker tone that's on the same basic level of what you were doing. Just play around with the color wheel a bit and see if something jumps out at you. I don't advise going too dark because we're going to use a 2-level depth here. So the shadows, the first shadows, these can actually work. You can actually do just like a one level shadow picture. But for mine, I'm going to do 2. So this is the first level of shadow, and I'm just putting it on with a basic hard brush. This is actually my drawing pen, so I'm just getting the basic blocks of shadow down. I'll be refining them much more later. Most of the time I want to keep this layer locked, because that enables me to make some wild strokes without going off of that base that I've set down and that we filled in. I'll probably be finding some places where I didn't quite fill in and white will be showing through. Sometimes it's easier to see once you have colors around it. So as I go, you may notice me filling in parts that you may have noticed before were not filled in, or you may have not noticed it. I certainly didn't notice it, so when I unlock the layer, it's usually because I noticed something that I need to fill in on the base layer. This happens even later, so just get used to it. It'll be very quick, but it's part of the process, really, and it's something that you just kind of have to get used to. But essentially here, I'm putting down blocky shadows. These are pretty rough, and I don't really have to worry about making them too exact, because that's not really the point right now. One of the reasons why I like to do this all on one layer, with the base coat and the basic shadows, it gives it kind of a dynamic look, but it also makes it possible for me to go without putting down like a palette, because I don't really want to be married to a palette when I'm doing something like this. I want to be able to use the color dropper and go in and get a color and be able to use it. So that's going to be a big part of developing this picture, is using the color dropper and developing it based on what the colors are that you see. I feel like this leads to a more dynamic coloring, and it's also a lot easier. When you get too attached to a palette, I feel like sometimes it can actually harm your work. Like it can make you kind of feel obligated to keep with that specific palette, when in reality it doesn't always help you. Like sometimes it does. Sometimes it's really great if you've got like a specific character or something. If you have a specific palette for that character, it's sometimes very easy just to make a palette and just eyedrop that palette. That's totally fine. Here I'm just using the fill sometimes, mostly using my personal pen that I did, but you can really use any pen. I just decided to use basically something that's like one of the tech pens, but with a few adjustments to suit my style. I have a particular way of doing things, and of course I've calibrated the pen too. Clip Studio Paint or Manga Studio 5 is one of those great programs that's very helpful for natural feeling drawing, so it's very good for that. I always recommend it because it's personally my favorite, and I think it does the best with art production, especially if you're a comic related artist. But even if you're not, I feel like the drawing and the coloring, as you can see here, is vastly superior to anything else that I've used. It's just very easy, very, very uncomplicated. There's so many things that you can adjust if you need to or want to, but you don't have to really adjust it too much to enjoy it properly. Sometimes I find just experimenting works very well, and part of my philosophy is, even if it's technically correct, it should look right. If it doesn't look right, then don't do it. It doesn't matter if something is technically correct if it still doesn't look right. Because I have found a lot of people giving unsolicited advice and saying, oh, this is wrong, or that looks wrong, or something like that, when I know it's technically correct. So a lot depends on not only whether or not it looks right, but whether or not it looks right to the person in particular. So you can't always anticipate what will look right to other people, but I figure if you make it look right to you, then that's usually the best you can do, and that's a good thing. It can help sometimes too if you look at some models, and here we've got the basic shadows. So we've got that all on one layer, and I'm going to create another layer, and I'm going to clip it to the layer below it. That means that it's basically like the locked layer, in that I can make wide and wild strokes and it won't go off of that base. I set it to multiply, and I'm using a light pink. I'm trying to experiment, which you'll need to do too. I like to use a larger brush for most of it, and a light touch, because I just want this to be a blush on the skin to give it a more dynamic feel and a more realistic feel. I'm putting the pink where realistically more blood vessels would be closer to the surface, so it'll look more realistic and it'll give him a blush of life instead of just a very flat, cartoony look. The basic cell shading is totally okay though, and I really like a lot of what many artists can do with cell shading. In fact, you can get cell shading really super dynamic, but as I'm not concentrating on that in this picture, I didn't develop the cell shading to a level where it could stand on its own. This kind of base is what I do for the more dynamic kind of painting instead of just cell shading, because you can do a lot with cell shading if you go in and make it very streamlined and stylistic. And I love cell shading because it can just give a great impression. Now I went back and blurred with a strong blur the base layer because I'm going to start developing it now. Just a basic blur can work. You can also use a Gaussian blur, whatever you're most comfortable at. And I've created a new layer, clipped it to the layer below again, and now I'm using a basic soft airbrush at a size that's comfortable to me to develop that shading more. I've used the eyedropper, well, the color dropper. I always call it the eyedropper, but it's really just a color dropper. It's the dropper. To go in and get the color that was combined from the blush and the base tones. So this is actually serving to blend it a bit, and I'm bearing down just a little bit. I'm being mainly light, but slightly bore down. This allows you to develop and contour the muscles, so it looks very natural. And don't worry about using the undo button. That's what it's there for. If you find yourself not liking where something's going, just undo. Or, if you like, use the dropper and get colors from surrounding areas, just like that, to make it a little lighter. And sometimes, yeah, you can pick up the wrong color. You can actually choose whether it picks up from the specific layer or just from like all the combined layers too, but I find that picking up the combined layers is usually a better choice. I don't like too many hard edges when I'm doing this, and that's one of the reasons why I like to use the dropper and blend as much as I can. I don't go overboard with blending because you can use the blend tool, but if you use the blend tool, as you can see, and you don't have like quite enough stuff on the layer, it can just basically bleed through to see another layer. So unless you have it all on one layer, which you can do, you can compress it to one layer if you want to, if you're comfortable working that way. I prefer to keep it as a couple of layers and just use the airbrush because I feel like it gives me a better result and it's a bit easier to work with. Your mileage may vary. You may find it much more comfortable to work on just one layer, as some people actually do. But I'm just going in, and in many parts I'm doing a very light touch to develop the shadow as a soft shadow. I want it to be as soft as possible while still defining the shape. So I don't want it to be too soft. I don't want it to just be a vague, threatening shape. I want it to be something that makes it look like he has substance, make it look like his muscles could be, squeezed. Because I know we all want to squeeze a bit of muscle every now and then. But as you see, you can drop the, drop the surrounding area to get a better idea of what's going to blend in with the eye when you look at something like this. Have an idea of the shapes of the bones and muscles, because that really does help. And don't be afraid to use like different sizes as well. If something doesn't appear to be the right size, size it up or size it down, use some different pressure, use a different approach, even if only slightly. It can really help sometimes. It can make all the difference. With hands, I find it's good to define a bit of the bone structure, since hands tend to be that way. I mean, if you look at your own hand, you'll be able to see a bit of the bone structure and some of the muscles and a lot of other different things. So examine your own hands under a light. That's one of the things that as artists we have very, very openly available to us is our own hands. So use yourself as a model, or use any of the many resources online. Develop it a bit. Don't develop it too much, though. I feel like I don't particularly like the attitude that more photorealism is better, because photorealistic does not mean better. And I think it's a lot better to have a stylistic style, than to just go photorealistic all the time. So I think getting the idea, as I said earlier, if it looks right, it's generally better than if it is technically, correct. Because an audience will appreciate it more if they can look at it and be like, yeah, that looks right. But as an artist, I feel like also, when I can look at it and be happy with it and feel like it looks right, it makes me happier. It makes me able to make peace with it more easily, because we are all our own worst critics. And most of the time what we see as problems are things that other people really don't see. Develop the facial structures here, and we're about to put on the second layer of shadow. But develop the basic facial structures, develop the basic muscular and skeletal structures, and we can go back at any time, take off the layers, get the base coat, touch up the base coat as we need, because we've got the layers where we want to. And there we go, we've got some good basics going on. We've got to move down to the lower trunk. This is a place that can sometimes get a little bit tricky, but it's a lot of fun too. I don't really like sometimes when artists will do like a six-pack or defined abs or something like that, it looks really clunky and artificial. I prefer a slightly more natural build, and six-packs generally don't occur in nature, so I try and use a bit of a more understated but still very fit build when I deal with the abdominal muscles. But you want to be sure to get the definition. You want to be sure to get it like a trail of promise down here as the Apollo's girdle and whatnot. This is a very sensual and appealing part of the male body, that definition at the hips. So it's important to get that right. And as you can see here, I'm using a slightly bigger brush, because the smaller brush, I don't need like the little strokes. I need a bigger stroke that gives me more of a coverage and more of a hint of shadow and definition. And here we'll do a little bit more with the side muscles. Those aren't ribs, by the way. Those are defined muscles that go down the torso. A lot of people confuse them with ribs, but in fact, that is not anatomically the case. And something else, be sure to save. Be sure to save regularly, because you never know when crashes may happen or something may happen. So let's take a look. It's starting to look good. Now I'm going to put the second layer of shadow on, and it's going to be on the same layer that I put the first layer on. You can actually do a different layer if you prefer, but I think it gives a better impression and allows you to blend it a little bit if you just go in with a light, soft brush and accent the shadows. With the darker shade, which is slightly further in of the same base coat of the skin, with the darker shade, less is more. So don't overdo it, just accent some places. We're basically just adding definition to the physique. We can go through in a variety of places. This is just going to make it look more dynamic, and it's usually good to have a contrast too, like to have in certain places the dark just bordering the base coat or even highlights, which we will add shortly. But it helps to give our musculoskeletal structures much more definition. When you have the dual level of shadows, it adds so much more. You can totally finish a picture with just the one level of shadow, though, especially if you want to just do something quick and give someone an idea, give someone like a three-dimensional impression, and give them an impact. You can totally just add the blush and put it all together, do some light blending. It's completely presentable as one level shadow. But for something like this, I like to do a bit more than just the one level, because it gives such a striking appearance, I feel like. And as usual, I'm going in and occasionally picking out colors with the dropper. It just helps a lot to accent some of these spots, to make it easier on the eye to identify those spots. It's sort of like we're bodybuilding ourselves, but we're building someone else's body. And those are those muscles I was telling you about that are not ribs. But I'm going back and fixing a couple of things in the base coat. And sometimes you will use the wrong brush. You'll get so used to clicking a button on your tablet or something and use the wrong brush. It is very helpful to have the two slots for color, so that if you have a particular color you want to keep, it's easier to keep it. But this way, it's just as easy to do the little dropper and pick the color, because that's really more important. What it looks like on the canvas, what it looks like on the picture, you can always adjust it to be different as needed. If you want it to be, slightly darker or slightly lighter, or, more of one color or another. But with the smaller details, I tend to use a smaller brush, and when we get larger, I like to size up a bit. Also, with blending, it tends to do a little bit better in my experience if it's a slightly bigger brush, because then you don't have the little strokes. Then it's easier to just go in with a light touch and blend it with the other colors. And you can really just fuss with it as long as you like. Whatever suits you, whatever floats your boat, essentially. I'll zoom out a lot and then zoom back in and do a bunch of eyedropping. There I go, calling it the eyedropper again. Maybe that is the name. I mean, I know it's technically the color dropper, but I've heard other people call it the eyedropper too. That's how I got in the mode of doing that. It's probably a bad habit, but anyway, you can just go in and drop colors, and that will help you immensely with blending. So at this point we've got plenty of definition. We've got some of the underlying colors that we lay down as the base, and they look very good here. Most of what we've done, though, has been defined by the airbrush. And it's looking good. I'm adding some highlights here. Very subtle stuff. Use a soft touch, a soft brush. And don't overdo the highlights. If you overdo the highlights, it ends up looking ridiculous. So less is way more on highlights. Just like it's good not to overuse the second level of shadow. But it's generally good to have an idea of how you want to highlight it, you know, keep it consistent, keep it in one direction as best you can. Now I'm going in and adding another layer of deeper red. With the lips you want to do just mainly in the center. I'm using a soft pencil here to do some of the gleam on the lips. Then I'm going to go in with a soft airbrush and make it look a bit more natural. Now I'll add a little bit to the eyes, because the eyes do tend to have a natural gleam, and the cheeks have a bit of gleam too, unless you powder them, which Tonian definitely doesn't do. So, and the nose, of course, since it's a bit prominent. Gives it a three-dimensional effect. Essentially, I'm just using a lot of airbrushes here, and now here's time for another multiply layer. And I'm using a dark red here. Well, a dark pink, because it transfers to a dark red when you multiply it. You may want to play around a bit. Here's my highlights layer. And you want to make sure to have a layer for highlights, because if you have a multiply layer, which is the layer like I added the red and added the nipples, the white won't show up. Multiply doesn't really work with lighter colors. It doesn't really add very much, so you'll want to make a separate layer above that to add your highlights. So here's the start of the eyes. I just used two different purples and then added a third purple for the pupils. And now I added a layer on top of the line work so that it'll allow me to add highlights that actually override the line work. Some people like to add a bit of gray to the eye to add shadow, but I don't really care about that. So now we are on the hair layer, and we've locked the layer so that I can use those wide strokes. I use basically a flat brush that is an oil paint. This one's called a painterly brush, so it's similar to the painter program, but you can use whatever brush you want, really. I'd advise using a size that you're comfortable with. Just use little strokes for the hair, because there's going to be a lot of little detail that you can add to it. Put down the base coat, then just like with the skin, move in a bit, add some basic shadow. You can be a bit flashier with the hair though, and here we're adding the secondary shadow. You can actually add several levels of shadows to hair if you want to. But like the skin, I'm just doing like a dual level tone here. And the light strokes here will help you to blend the colors, which is helpful on hair. But since hair is so different from skin, you don't want to get it too much like the skin. Like don't use large airbrushes, I feel like, unless you're trying to just kind of give it a gloss over to give it a unity. I feel like this way is a bit better, because it might take a little bit of time and precision, but the overall effort is worth it, because the effect is so striking when you have like an oil brush. It gives it more of an individual strand look that looks very good and doesn't take a huge amount of time to do. So basically I'm just going around and blending in the various levels of the blue-gray that I have here. And now I'm adding highlights, and all of this is on one layer. But yeah, pressure is important. Sometimes you'll find yourself accidentally applying a bit too much pressure and it'll come out way brighter than you intend. But just play with it a bit, you know. Like I said before, don't be afraid to use the undo button if something comes out and you don't like the way it looks, because that's what it's there for. That's why we love digital painting a bit more than regular oil painting, because it's much kinder to our mistakes. Just doing a little effect down there. As you can see, it looks quite good. Okay, so now I'm gonna do the other little bits. I don't like the way that looks with his skin tone, so I can adjust it. And I'm going to need to adjust that just a bit. And as before, layer placement is important. So it'll be important where you have all these layers arranged. But I'm just going in with a lighter pencil and a light touch, doing some highlights here. And they're very slight highlights at first, but now I'm going to make them lighter by using white with a lighter pencil and doing some more highlighting. This is going to be very quick stuff, basically, because I'm not that invested in the accessories. They can make for a good accent, though. So now that I've got this in, I'm just going to do this real quick. It's not too hard to make something look three-dimensional when it's kind of cylindrical. You just have to add in some shadow, add in some highlights, give it some shape and substance. Give it some levels of shadow. And now you can use like the quick mask trick, where you select a quick mask and then cancel the quick mask. You can also do the magic wand select, but I'm so used to the quick mask thing. And yeah, unlock your layer there. And all you have to go through is exactly what I did for the hose. So just add the shade, add the highlight, do a little bit more there. The bottom, give it more of a shape, because edges do that. Now I'm going to just be easy. Do something that doesn't have too terribly much depth to it, but it looks good anyway. It's this schematic. And there you go. That's an easy way to make it look three-dimensional and have substance. Now I'm going to add the body hair with my special body hair brush. I'm going to do that on a different layer. And you can download this brush if you're a patron on Patreon. I mean, you can download it for free, but it was done for my patrons on Patreon. So if you use it, let me know, and consider being a patron on Patreon, because they get all kinds of bonuses like this. It makes this so much easier and so much less tedious. Now I'm using a smaller brush to do his armpit hair, which guys do have. And now I'm just altering the color of the layer to match his hair color. It's basically just a darker version of the hair on his head, so it'll look natural and it'll look similar. Now I'm doing the same thing with the line art, because I don't like just plain black lines. And now adding a texture overlay set to about 20% gives it a nice, rich, organic look. Now a background that I'm going to drag down there and adjust the color of. And adjust that a little bit. And now here's a fun little trick. that I learned. Combine the showing layer, which means the visible layer, do a Gaussian blur at about 10, select all and copy, then undo back, but still copy in, set it to about 30%, and you've got a nice glow, so it looks really good. Now the only thing left is to sign my name. I hope you've enjoyed this. Follow me on social media, become a patron on Patreon if you like it, and don't forget to save. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for your support, and I hope this video has helped you a lot. Ask me any questions you have, and I'll be sure to respond to you as soon as possible. Patrons on Patreon get the option to request specific videos, so if you'd like a specific video for you, consider becoming one. I'll see you later. Thanks again. Remember to follow and subscribe. Bye.